Okay, and
Okay,
three, two, one.
so hello everybody, and welcome to episode 9 of Free Kiwis. Today we have a very special guest, Helen Pluckrose. She's by now a well-known writer, an intellectual, public intellectual. She's also the editor of Areo magazine, which is a fantastic liberal magazine, liberal website. And most recently, she's the author with James Lindsay of Cynical Theories, which I always hold up the book and then I remember that we're audio only. But anyway, Cynical Theories, How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody. So Helen, thanks for coming on.
It's great to be here.
So I just wanted to start with the book, actually. One of the things we were talking about in a previous podcast is if you have any experience of post-colonialism or various forms of post-modernism in the university, especially if you studied literature. If you studied literature in the 80s and the 90s, you might remember postmodernism as something quite playful. The stress was on moving away from meta-narrative, being critical of meta-narratives. And after that point, it seems like there was a turn. And in your book, you describe this as applied postmodernism. And I think there's a later stage where it becomes reified. So can you just explain what you mean by this move from playful postmodernism to applied and reified postmodernism, and how that came about?
Yeah, well, the what we call the highly constructive stage, the original postmodernists, they weren't. They were quite hopeless. They didn't really have that much of an aim apart from to pick holes in things. They were radically skeptical and disillusioned that we could really count on any of the systems and the structures that we'd previously counted on. And we're looking at a time in the 60s. There'd been 2 world wars, empire had fallen as the end of Jim Crow. So it was a Marxism, which had been the strongest framework for the academic left, had catastrophic results. So I think in the original postmodernists, you've got this sense of nothing can be counted on, that everything is just a meta-narrative which people have made up to read the world through, and we can't really count on anything at all. And so the focus was on pulling things apart, and it was playful, as you say, but I think sometimes people think that means that it was joyful, when generally it wasn't. It was really quite despairing. If you're looking at the work of people like Baudrillard, for example, or Deleuze, who of course ultimately committed suicide, there's a real sort of sense of despair of anything authentic or real that was going on with the postmodernists. But they burnt themselves out within about 20 years, because there's only so long you can keep deconstructing everything until it's all in pieces and there's nothing more to do. But something happened in 1989, and there was a sudden flood of writing from various different fields within the humanities and social sciences and law, even, where people, a new wave of theorists were saying these postmodern ideas that that knowledge is a construct of power, and that it's perpetuated in language and discourses, in ways of talking about things, is valuable. This cultural constructivist idea is valuable, but we have to accept that something is real or we can't do anything. So what is real is these systems of power and privilege. So this is when it became applied, and it became applicable and politicized. If we say that these systems of power and privilege are real, then these are the things that we have to dismantle. And now these postmodern ideas are usable. So we see people like Edward Said, who first describes himself as a Foucauldian, says that he wouldn't be able to write his Orientalism without Foucault. And then he talks about the need to rewrite the history of the East, which has been written by the West in order to construct itself in opposition to the West. And of course, there's actually some truth in that. But there's also this sort of new birth of hope that by addressing the language and the construct constructs of power being perpetuated in it, we can make society better again. And then at around 2010, this kind of optimistic activist wave started to become very, very solid and very sure of itself. It was no longer radically skeptical. It accepted this as a fact. There are these invisible power systems. They're called things like whiteness, patriarchy, cisnormativity. They are present in absolutely everything, and they're oppressing people at all times in all ways. You need this kind of critical training in order to be able to see them, to have the critical consciousness to see them. The colloquial term for this, of course, is woke. And when you can see them, and you then have a moral imperative to make everybody else see them, and to speak in the right ways, and to not speak in the wrong ways. And then we can start to remake society without these power systems. So that's the, very simplistically, the evolution of those few core ideas about power, knowledge, and language over the last 50 years.
So that idea that power hierarchies are real and are the only objective thing, was that something that came in from critical theory? Have I got that right? Is it?
Yeah, so I mean, the idea, if we take Kimberly Crenshaw's argument for it, for example, now she describes intersectionality as contemporary politics linked with postmodern theory. And what she means by this is the politics of the Black radical left, that tradition, the New Left, the Black Panthers, and that sort of drew on Marcusean thought, but then linked it with postmodern concepts of social constructivism in language, in attitudes and biases. So after the liberal civil rights movements had achieved their goals of equality legally, attitudes didn't just automatically change. Racism still existed, sexism still existed, homophobia still existed. So the new theorists wanted a way to get at these attitudes and biases and unpick them and show how they were still working to hold certain people back. And I think there was certainly a lot of truth in that. I came into this in 1990. That was when I became politically active at the age of 16. And so I saw, you know, there was still some sexist attitudes about that I had some fun in puncturing. There was still some casual racism that needed strongly objecting to. So that they weren't entirely wrong. But this idea that what we need to do is decide that everything is socially constructed, that it's all about discourses, and that identity politics is the way to address it, to be empowering. So Crenshaw, in that same essay, she says, look at the difference between I am Black as a statement of identity and I am a person who happens to be Black. And she argues for the former as a way of group empowerment, which really does come from that Black radical tradition.
Yes.
And to push back at this white supremacy, which is now, though, constructed in postmodern ideas of discourses, which are very, very difficult to actually get at. They're unfalsifiable, and they've got increasingly more and more, you know, sort of vague and nebulous. So it's getting very difficult to argue with it at the same time as they're getting much more certain and authoritarian in enforcing it.
Yes, it seems odd to me in a way that, I mean, I can perfectly well understand why people who were suffering oppression, and I was, you know, an adult at that time, and I can remember the sexism and especially the homophobia of the time. I must say that was something that really quite activated me. But what I did observe over the following couple of decades is that without any kind of great authoritarianism, we moved right away from that. And likewise, explicit racism and sexism also receded vastly during the 1990s and 2000s. And yet somehow you know, now it's just flared up into this enormous deal again, when actually we ought to be celebrating how far we've come and maybe tidying up a few things, but it doesn't seem proportionate to suddenly be obsessed with these identity categories all over again. What do you think has led to that all of a sudden?
I think so. So the idea we've got, say, within critical race theory, people like Derek Bell and We Are Not Saved, where he argues, and a lot of the critical race theorists argue, that racism hasn't gone away. It has just changed form. It's gone underground. It's become harder and harder to get at. Therefore, there is a need to dig at deeper and deeper for it. And I agree with you. I think that it's quite clear that liberalism as a moral norm in which we just don't evaluate people by their race, gender and sexuality. But if we have these biases, we keep them to ourselves, because the general consensus is they're both stupid and unethical. That was working. I wouldn't say it had completely worked, and it certainly hasn't worked with every individual. There are still racists, sexists and people out there, but it was working, and there was good reason to think it would continue working. Everybody, I think, cringes at Christmas with their grandfather or their father, because we can see in this real time how much ideas have changed. You know, if you're having to explain to Auntie Doris why the word darky isn't really acceptable, then we can see that attitudes have changed. So a liberal humanist like me would say that we need to continue doing that. Critical social justice activists would be concerned about the idea of celebrating progress as complacency. What they would argue is that for white people, we've made ourselves very comfortable by defining racism as only the most egregious and overt racial hostility. And that enables us to overlook more subtle systems which explain disparities that affect people of different races. And of course, it isn't actually that simple. So we know that in America, for example, where critical race theory dominates and a lot of the stats come from, they're one of the least successful groups statistically is African Americans, while one of the most successful groups statistically is recent African immigrants. This indicates that anti-Blackness is not straightforwardly the problem. It doesn't indicate that there isn't prejudice against a cultural group known as African Americans, and studies have in fact suggested that there are. By sending names, job applications with African names or names recognized as African American, it's been demonstrated that there is prejudice against African Americans. But this is why we need the rigorous empirical scholarship to look at what's happening, to put systems in place such as blinding in interviews, and to continue the liberal norm of frowning consistently on people who evaluate others by immutable characteristics.
So can we go back for a minute? You said a lot that's really interesting there. I wonder.
Sorry, I monologue.
You're what? Sorry.
I monologue. Sorry, I get onto my soapbox and then.
Oh, no, that was brilliant. No, that's what we want. That's why we're talking to you. But I just wanted to go back a bit to this sort of linguistic turn. I think in the book it's one of the themes that you identify as central to postmodernism. You call them the four themes, and one of them is this linguistic theme. So that's one of these places where the postmodernists or the social justice theorists seem to have something going for them. They have something on their side, and it's the basic intuition and the basic observation that language does have effects in the world. Obviously, if I hurl a racial epithet at somebody in order to demean them, most people would say that was racist. And you know, and to some extent, they're right that if we kind of downplay real episodes like that, then we're sort of making ourselves too comfortable and avoiding dealing with racism. Okay, but there's surely a point to which it can be taken where it becomes too much, right? Because language also has a bit of wiggle room. Language is also something that we use to play with concepts without really meaning things, to make jokes sometimes which aren't meant in a mean way. And in a way, the postmodernists seem to be forgetting the previous part of their inheritance, which is this stress on how language is kind of slippery and doesn't necessarily attach to things in the world.
Well, aren't they really even postmodernists anymore? I mean, it seems to me that once you reify this concept of power hierarchy as a real objective truth, you can't really claim to be postmodernist, and neither but can you claim to be scientific, because as you said before, Helen, that theory is unfalsifiable. So it certainly isn't scientific in a Popperian sense, which is...
No, well, they certainly don't claim to be scientific. They regard science as a social construct that is Western and oppressive.
Sure.
And they don't claim to be postmodern either. We have, James and I have made this continuity because of the continued use of the work, particularly of Foucault, and of these particular ideas. I think I get quite annoyed when people use the term neo-Marxism to describe anything that isn't to do with class. And I will then say, if it's not about class, it's not Marxism. So I understand that why some intellectuals can get quite impatient and say, you can't call this postmodernism when it's a meta-narrative. This is mutually contradictory. So yes, I concede that point to them. If we want to argue about terminology, you can certainly make a good argument that that calling them postmodernists is not the most accurate way to describe them. And so I think critical social justice activists is the way to describe them. But we have to look at their postmodern roots when it comes to knowledge, power and language. There's a little bit of the Frankfurt School and the neo-Marxists in there with the idea of hegemony and the idea of overtaking institutions and not tolerating intolerance. So we can see that radical element in there as well. But what I wanted to get across to people, particularly in Cynical Theories, is that there is a continuity with the power, knowledge and language from the ideas of the original postmodernists, which have really solidified into a meta-narrative of their own now. I think it's really important for people to understand that epistemology if they're going to address the ideas as they are. Otherwise, they end up arguing with things that critical social justice activists don't really believe.
So the cynical part of your Cynical Theories title, does that refer to the solidification of objective power hierarchies? Because it seems to me that it, just going back to what I was saying before, it has no clear epistemic basis at all. It's an idea that seems to be just put in place in order to justify the activism. Would you see that as accurate, or am I missing something?
No, that is why we use the word skeptical. We don't think that the word cynical. We use cynical theories rather than critical theories or skepticism towards meta-narratives, because we think this way of looking at the world is much better described as cynicism. The postmodernists will tell us that they are defined as a skepticism toward the meta-narratives, Jean-Francois Lyotard would anyway, and they will call them critical approaches. But the criticism and skepticism were not inventions of the postmodernists. This had been going on for quite some time. The dominant skeptical system was science. And this is a kind of skepticism which says, how do we know this is true? If this wasn't true, how could we show that? And it's still looking for truth. the theories that we are looking at the moment aren't looking for truth. They think they've already found it. They think the explanation for everything is these power systems, and then they read them into them. So we believe that is essentially cynical. And it comes to a point where, as you said, some of it is really ridiculous. So a microaggression was one that really gets to me, and I bring it up a lot, was that you must never compliment a black speaker on being eloquent, because that implies that you are surprised that black people can be eloquent. Now, this is, I think, really racist, for one thing, and it makes it very difficult to actually treat people as people. We at Counterweight recently, we were approached by the Telegraph, and they wanted to know if any of our members would be willing to give them a short anonymous interview, and we were discussing among ourselves who would be best to do that. And our mental health lead, who'd spoken to quite a few of them, said, this guy, she picked out one man, and she said, he's the most eloquent, he's the most concise, he'll get to the point, he'll be great for a newspaper interview. And then it actually, because I'm so steeped in this, I'm thinking, can I actually say to him, we'd like you to do this because you're the most eloquent person at explaining your problems, because he's black. And, you know, it seems so ridiculous, because what he said when we told him that was thank you. he was very pleased to know that he had been so clear and able to give so much clarity to a problem that was going on at his workplace. It didn't occur to him that we would be surprised that he could do that because his skin was black. That's cynical, isn't it?
It's more than cynical, actually. It seems to me stultifying. It just shows how miserable you must be to live in that way all the time, to be constantly, you know, worried that every single thing you say is, I mean, almost inevitably got racism and sexism and all the rest of it tucked into it. And so you can't really express yourself clearly anymore, because you're constantly trying to negotiate this minefield of racial and sexual and other kinds of slurs.
Well, especially because the new doctrine seems to also be that intentionality doesn't matter. So and this, I think, is part of this linguistic turn, that the idea is it's all about this web of discourses. And so it's a structural problem, and that means that, you know, whatever you, Helen, may have meant by this man is eloquent, for example, that this man is eloquent, it doesn't really matter, because it's all, you're contributing to the system of linguistic oppression, right?
You are, and this is the thing where I often bring up Derald Wing Sue as example, because he was the person who produced the work on microaggressions. Thank you so much, Professor Sue. And he gives us an example, the time when he and an African-American colleague were asked to move to the back of a plane to balance it out because it was half empty. Now, he complained that this was a racist act. The air hostess, who was white, said, no, we just had to move some of the people at the front to the back. And he said it didn't matter what her intentions were. It was racist either way, because if she intended to pick the people who weren't white to move, then that was overt racism. They were less important. But if she didn't intend, that was because she had the benefit of white ignorance, in which she wouldn't realize that asking a black person to go and sit at the back has historical connotations which could be painful for an African-American person, because of the history of buses and being made to sit at the back, and Rosa Parks. And so the white person had the privilege of not having to have that in her head. And so she could ask him to go and sit at the back without it occurring to her that it could trigger those connotations. Now, I think for most black people, it wouldn't trigger those connotations. This is a projection of the scholars themselves. I'm pretty sure most black people would just move to the back of because, you know, they just accept the explanation that we have to move some people. But according to...
I guess to be generous, we could concede the point that we do miss things that other people are subject to. I recall as quite a young man, when I was at university, I was on a large campus, and there was an active sort of student life, and so people would go home to halls of residence after dark. And talking to a female friend who was intimidated to walk home to her hall after dark, and it struck me that that wasn't the way it was for me, and so I did have this moment of realization that she had to put up with something that I as a man didn't. And perhaps we could concede that we can have insights like that, but it seems to me that when it's sort of mandated by an ideology, it becomes quite psychologically oppressive to be kind of expected to be constantly delving into one's biases and so on that by definition we're unaware of, and that's no way to live, it seems to me.
No, there's always a kernel of truth in there. I found it very moving. I watched a video in which Black and South Asian Irish people spoke about what it was like being asked where they were from and being told that they didn't look Irish, and how they'd felt different and left out as a child by this, and some of them really felt quite tearful and deeply affected by this. And I think, well, yes, that must actually be horrible if you're a little girl or something, and you're with your friends and you're being told you're the one that doesn't look Irish when you consider yourself to be Irish, obviously. Then yes, this is a thoughtless statement. But I think Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff get it right in their book, where they don't say, we don't just dismiss this, but you could perhaps point it out to someone, like that video did. If it had ever been in my mind before to say to a Black Irish person, oh, you don't look Irish, I certainly wouldn't after having seen that video. So there are ways in which you can raise these kind of issues in a non-judgmental way. I remember that a trans woman, I'd written it as one word, trans woman, and she said to me that trans women generally prefer for it to be two words, because this is an adjective describing a woman, whereas a trans woman is a noun, which makes it a different thing to a woman. And I didn't actually at that point know that, and I wanted to support her rights to not, you know, people have rights not to see a woman as self-identified, but I wanted to identify her as a woman. And so that was a mistake on my part, and she pointed it out to me in a non-judgmental way, which was helpful. So I have now, as an editor of Areo, when people have used the word trans woman, as one word, I have asked them, did you mean by this to use it as a noun separate to woman, or did you not realise the connotations? And if they realise the connotations and they meant to do so, that's fine, because that's part of the conversation. But if it was an error, then we'll change it. So I think there are ways in which you can point out if somebody is being repeatedly insensitive, you can point it out without also assuming that everybody has this bias and people have the same bias in the same way. There's no grounds for individuality.
Yeah, so I'm listening to you and I'm kind of nodding along, and I agree with the cases that you brought up, but this is kind of a point that it's difficult to make, it's difficult to say, but it is also the case, isn't it, that some complaints of this nature don't really hold up. I mean, I think one of the points that Scott Lilienfeld, the late psychologist, made about microaggression research, the research of Sue in particular, was that it doesn't control for base rates in the particular sense that there are certain people that we know have more negative mindsets. Doesn't mean that we should completely dismiss them all the time, but it means they might have more of a tendency to complain about certain things. And I mean, my approach in all these cases would be to sort of investigate, but not necessarily to say, you know, everything you've said is true, because as you're acutely aware, I know, there's been a kind of rash of these complaints. I mean, in classics, we had a teacher in a private classics school who had a complaint that he was saying Caesar killed a lot of people on his campaigns, but then there was more stability afterwards. And he was mobbed online. Someone said he's literally justifying genocide, right? So people can sometimes come up with these complaints, and it seems like a callous move, but some of them we have to just say that's invalid, right?
I think, I mean, I think you certainly could say that if a student were to raise that issue, then sure, engage with it. They have the right to raise it, but I think at some point, yeah, we do have to say you're going to have to move on from this. Now, I think it's a mistake to indulge over sensitivities to an extent where it's actually going to mostly damage the person who it's supposed to help. I mean, this is what worries me. I find myself, when I read an awful lot of critical race theory in one sitting, that I start thinking in those terms. And I remember reading something like 6 books in 2 days when I was researching a certain paper, and then seeing a video of a mixed race young woman hugging her parents and thinking, oh, she still loves her mother even though she's white. And this had got into my head, and I'm fairly immune to it. So I'm really quite concerned about the effect that it has on people who aren't immune to it, who are deliberately opening themselves to it in an attempt to be more sensitive and more aware, and particularly for people who are, say, mixed race. I mean, this came home to us when we heard from a parent of a mixed race child who's become very upset because the school has started talking about white supremacy and anti-blackness, and he has a white mother and a black father, and now there's these moral values attached to each of his parents and these power dynamics, and he's not sure whether he is in the oppressor or oppressed category, and he's 8, and it's not remotely helpful. At some point you have to say to people, I think you've got to try and rise above that. If it was meant unkindly, then tell that person, I didn't appreciate that, then move on.
Yes, it seems to me that there could be some assistance to this whole issue from my field, which is cognitive psychology, because in that field, we're very aware that there's a huge amount of cognitive processing that goes on unconsciously, that goes on, well, we could say pre-consciously, actually, to kind of distinguish it from a Freudian unconscious or something like that. But there's an awful lot of information that we process just instantaneously, and we have to, because the world's a complex place. And so in order to negotiate the familiar, we automatize a whole lot of our mental processes. And that's inevitable, and that will involve categorizing things and people. And once we've categorized them, well, the definition of a category really is that it has a whole lot of attributes that we invest in instances of that category when we perceive them. But it seems to me where it goes wrong is this, again, this obsession with power hierarchies and infusing what I just said with a whole lot of meaning in terms of power hierarchies and privilege and all of this, which brings in a huge moral dimension to what is actually an inevitable human function. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I do, and I think I see what you mean. I mean, as a cognitive psychologist, would you agree with the way that I as somebody who reads psychology as an amateur, is seeing a lot of what's happening is the construction of negative schemas, which people are then taught to read the world through, and which is actually likely to disadvantage their chances of success within it. If you go into a situation believing that it's set up against you, that's probably not going to help you to thrive.
Indeed. In fact, what happens is that you start to, as you said, when you read those critical race texts and you start to see the world through that lens, or you start to see situations through that lens, that is what's happening. And in fact, if you practice doing that enough, you'll start to automatize those schemas, and then they're difficult to put aside. So I completely agree with that. And I think it goes back to what we were discussing at the outset, which is, you know, how much progress we seem to make under a kind of classical liberal paradigm. And now I really worry that we are endangering it, because it seems to me the only outcome of this eventually, if people start to interpret the world through this lens, you know, if our social and political paradigm shifts to one that operationalizes that schema too deeply, then we set ourselves up for all sorts of conflicts that we really don't want. And part of me wonders whether there is actually some malfeasance on the part of people who are promulgating these theories, that they actually want a bit of mayhem or something. And it's not so hard to draw that conclusion when you see what's happening in the United States, or what has been happening in terms of the violence in the streets there on both ends of the political spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to always assume that people are trying to do the right thing, even when they're doing catastrophically the wrong thing. But I am, and I'm certainly not alone. We're hearing from enormous numbers of psychologists, therapists, social workers about their concerns with this negative ideas that people are being taught, which then leads them to catastrophize and be overly sensitive to situations which they may not be interpreting correctly. So there's a wonderful book coming out by a group of psychologists, psychiatrists, and therapists who are going to look at this in a different way. And I'm hopeful that we're going to see a big pushback from the field of psychology, because it is particularly dangerous psychologically. You know, because I consider myself a pretty privileged person generally, but I occasionally get things which could be considered sexism. But I think there's a way that you can push back at this without being catastrophic about it. After the third time I walked into my local supermarket and was approached by the same salesperson offering me my dream kitchen, I said, I don't dream about kitchens, even though I have a vagina. That I think is a reasonable thing to respond, because he really wasn't approaching men and asking them if they wanted a dream kitchen. And I was feeling a little bit irritated, but that's humor. That's, you know, we can, I think, still address these things. Sometimes people are too black and white, and they think everybody has to either, you know, sort of toughen up and pull themselves up by the bootstrap and stop ever taking offense at anything, even when it is actually very thoughtless and could do with being pointed out. Or we have to be overly sensitive about absolutely everything and watch everything we say and try and anticipate any connotation that could possibly be made from it.
Yes. And also perhaps have a bit of humility about things, which is to say, I mean, that guy no doubt had a schema about women, that they like kitchens or whatever, and he was just running that schema. And, you know, I can completely understand how irritating it was and why you pointed it out, but in the end he's just running a schema like everybody else as they walk around in the world.
And he's probably running it because of all the people he's ever approached about kitchens, the majority of people who have been interested have been women.
Right.
So he's probably doing a statistical analysis in there as well.
That's what our brain does. It's a big statistical analysis engine, yes.
So I think this is interesting, because this is, I think, maybe one of the healthy insights in a way of postmodernism. As with the Greek cynics and the Greek skeptics and even Zen Buddhism has this emphasis, which is it can sometimes be healthy to step away from your schemas, from your meta-narratives, and to just sort of assess how they're holding up against the evidence of the world. But the step in all these traditions, there's a temptation to take a step from it's healthy to step back and look at your meta-narratives to all meta-narratives are false. And once you get to that stage, you're actually contradicting yourself, right? Because the whole idea that meta-narratives are false is itself a kind of meta-narrative. And I think that this is what can be so frustrating with talking to the sort of modern wave of cynics, or whatever you want to call them, that they sort of reserve the right to criticize your meta-narrative. But then, as Michael was saying at the beginning, there's this very strong assumption built into their system, which is sort of not backed up empirically, which is we think that, or we know the world is structured in this oppressive way, what you call the postmodern political principle. So it's almost like, you can't argue with that, but they can pick away at everything that you say in this very sort of passive way, that they don't even have to engage with the argument. I've experienced this in Zen Buddhist circles as well. It's kind of like certain people reserve the right to themselves to say, well, that's just your thoughts, but you can't say to them, well, that's just your thoughts.
Right. I mean, this is, I think, a constant with humans. Those of us who have a tendency to zealotry believe that we have seen the light. We are actually looking for this simplistic explanation that can then give us clear guidelines on how to act. And, I think it's very useful that the African-American vernacular English word woke has become applied to this critical social justice approach, because it really is the same as having seen the light, of being enlightened, this sort of very powerful feeling that is very seductive to people, that if you just understand this one sort of approach to things, everything will become clear. So obviously the most common examples we see of this is within religion. So I was arguing with somebody today who was speaking to me very, very much like a critical race theorist, but he was in fact defending Catholicism. And instead of accusing me of willful ignorance for not accepting his stance on things, he accused me of willful, well, I can't, sorry, I've lost it now, but being willfully obtuse, I was apparently, because I didn't see that he was right about his Catholic beliefs. And I think once you've gone into that, there's very little you can do to reach somebody who is already there, because it's very much, I suspect, like the conspiracy theory mindset, where there's some kind of reward there for having worked it out, for having access to this knowledge that the average person doesn't have. And I think that we have to really marginalize the committed devotees and focus on those who are sympathetic without fully understanding or having bought into it.
That's right. It could be what you just said, and it could, that kind of special knowledge feeling of being one of the knowledge elite or something, and it could just be simply the comfort of certainty that once you take on board that God made the world in 7 days, or that power hierarchies that explain everything, you have a frame which you can feel secure in about your epistemology. Whereas if you take a Popperian view, a falsificationist view, then you're never in that frame. I mean, there are obviously operational things which we take with a degree of certainty because we couldn't live otherwise. But in a deeper epistemological sense, when we're trying to explain complicated things like social processes, we absolutely, as Popperians or as scientists or even just as classical liberals, accept that all ideas are contestable, and that we won't reach a grand conclusion where we suddenly feel like we've worked it all out. And really, that is just the way we have to go on being if we want to be able to continue to make progress in knowledge and hopefully in things like equality and respect for one another.
I think that's true. And when obviously scientists are people as well, and they're just as prone to unwarranted certainties as anybody else. But
indeed,
in the ideal of science, there is always the hypothesis, which is never proven but can only be disproven. There is always the understanding that knowledge is provisional. And essentially, even when we don't say it, don't say the words "as far as we can know," you know, the things we consider ourselves to know with most certainty, say, for example, that natural selection is real. That's very unlikely to be disproven now, but we would still say this is provisionally true based on everything that we can know right now. We don't say that in every sentence because it gets very unwieldy, but that is the epistemology underlying it. And quite often the postmodernists and the descendants of them will strawman that position, and you'll often hear them say things like, science thinks it already has all the answers, it thinks it knows everything. And that's such a fundamental misunderstanding of how science works that it's something that really needs to be engaged with. And I think it's good to think of it as a kind of a spectrum. If you imagine this pure postmodernist and this pure scientist, they both believe that an objective reality actually does exist. They both accept that we cannot be absolutely sure of having obtained it, but the pure postmodernist would like to stand there in the fog of not knowing and theorize about how we came to decide it was true in the first place, while the scientist would like to develop as many ways as possible of minimizing error and then still follow the pursuit of truth. And yes, so that's...
Well, with the reified or applied postmodernists, it's almost like they take an even stronger step on occasion, which is we know how this idea has come about, and we have found that it came about in the wrong way. And not in, scientists can sometimes say this idea came about in the wrong way, in a sense which is sort of more epistemically robust. For example, you didn't control for the following things in your experiment. But often nowadays it seems to be that there's this move, oh, that idea was discovered by a colonialist or a white man or whatever, and therefore we have to say that it's false, which, doesn't help.
Or at least highly suspect.
Or at least highly suspect.
If you read the section on research justice in Cynical Theories, I think that really covers the worst of it. It's a really quite alarming idea which isn't even necessary. We can understand that some things are knowledge, are science, back to that Latin root of the word to know as a fact as far as we can, and other things are experiences, perceptions and customs, and they're equally important. Sometimes they're more important. This is where people like me will often be accused of being, a naive positivist and not like a robot. I study late medieval history, for goodness sake. I'm not a scientist, but they will assume that because I think objective knowledge exists, I don't think that experiences and feelings matter. Now, as humans, we're generally more interested in how people are feeling and thinking than what the facts are about them. So it's a false dichotomy which doesn't need to exist. We can care about both without trying to make them both forms of knowledge.
Right. So I think we're coming up to, I don't know, more than 50 minutes. So I just wanted to turn maybe in the last 10 minutes or so, a few minutes, is to...
I've just noticed my battery is running out. Could you pass me the charger, please?
Oh, okay. We'll
carry on.
We'll sort of go into the final stretch anyway. But I just wanted to turn now to the question of what we do about this. And I have a sort of worry, and it's a very kind of present concern and dilemma about how to approach this, because of course Michael and I both work in universities. And the dilemma really it comes from something I heard Brett Weinstein say in a video about Evergreen that you were in as well. And he said, what the problem is that we've given affirmative action to certain ideas. So we sort of let certain ideas into the academy because we were trying to be nice for certain political reasons when they didn't really merit being there. And I think this idea I've just mentioned, the so-called genetic fallacy, that you can just judge an idea on the context in which it arose, that's the kind of idea I just think is dramatically wrong, and it has bad effects on the epistemic environment, on the intellectual environment. Okay, so that's sort of where I am in my own beliefs, but then I don't just want to be a Viktor Orban and sort of ban a whole section of inquiry in the way that in Hungary they ban gender studies. And I have colleagues who do work which is, I would say, inflected by postmodernism, and a lot of it's great, and they're working pretty sincerely with texts. And of course, I have my own approaches to texts and history, and some people may disagree with that. So how do we find this middle way between pushing back against some of these ideas and not becoming authoritarians ourselves?
Well, I'm talking now about those of us at Counterweight. We will oppose strongly any attempts to censor any kind of critical social justice theory. We don't want the government to ban it in universities. The ideas need to die in the same way that alchemy and phrenology died. Nobody banned them. They just fell out of favor because they were foolish and they didn't work. I think this is the natural death that a lot of these ideas have to take. I think that other intellectuals working in the area of epistemology and ethics can help that effort if they're allowed to, and part of Heterodox's aim and our aim is to ensure that they are allowed to. But then I think there's a difference, and this is something that people don't often understand, where we would support the banning of mandatory training in certain kinds of theory, and that people have said, how can I possibly be a defender of free speech but support banning critical race training? And this is a difference between forcing people to go to church or not preventing them from going to church.
It seems obvious.
It really should seem obvious. And so, I'm certainly not a fan of Donald Trump in any way, and I thought his rationale for his ban on mandatory training for federal employees with the whole sort of anti-American stick was quite silly, because there's nothing more American than critical race theory. It's very, very American. But that plan was actually a liberal one. And this is something that I would like governments to do, in the same way that I would like them to protect, say, a Muslim employee from being expected to affirm that Christ was the Son of God if they work for a Christian organization. So too should people not be expected to affirm that they have a gender identity, or affirm that they are racist, or that they have experienced certain types of racism. This keeping open of freedom of belief and freedom of speech is vital. So for us at Counterweight, we have academics, but because Heterodox and FIRE and other organizations exist, and because academics already have an advantage in being able to formulate and defend their own arguments, we focus more on employees whose skill sets may be different to those who may not be accustomed to making in writing strong arguments for their ethical positions and defending them. So 75% of the people we help are non-academic employees, and it's working. Essentially, we help people to write knowledgeable and principled objections to training or policies as they arise. We get them on diversity, equity and inclusion boards. We don't recommend that they start ranting and raving about how awful critical race theory is. We ask them that they ask their employer to keep the workplace open and inclusive of a variety of different worldviews, and not to enforce or impose any one on any of their employees. That works. It works surprisingly often.
It's really valuable that you're doing it as well, because although, of course, the university has been in many ways the source of all of this, and in many ways is getting worse and not better. What seems to me even more pressing is the extent to which all of this is spilled out into the wider society, and now seems to be increasingly accepted by the corporate world, by governments of different political persuasions. And so that's where the real work needs to be done to turn back the tide towards classical liberal values, which, as you say, are, you know, a kind of plurality of points of view in workplaces and society at large. And if we can't do that, well, we're in real trouble. And it's good to see actually in the UK things like your organisation, as well as the Free Speech Union and things like that, who are doing that work for ordinary people who are being badly affected by these trends. So
some of the cases, and we're going to anonymise a lot of them and put them out there, and I think it will make people quite angry. You know, for example, we're currently helping an emergency services person avoid being disciplined for saying he's not going to stop and care what race or gender identity someone has when trying to save their lives. This is this is a ridiculous situation. We have a situation in which an Indian librarian is expected to testify at a decolonized library meeting to her experiences of racism when she doesn't think she's experienced any, but she thinks it might affect her job if she doesn't testify to the right kind of experience. It's infuriating, and what makes me most angry is when it's people who don't have that skill set where they can take on bureaucracy confidently in writing and fight back on a verbal level, and people, but you know, bureaucratic institutions will use this to bully them. That makes me very annoyed. I get particularly annoyed when we have people of racial or sexual minority who are being told how they should experience and believe the world works. And when we have humanitarian aids and charities diverting funds from people in desperate need of, you know, clean water and food and malaria treatment.
Trivial things like that, yes.
Yeah, it really is very serious, and it's much wider than the academy.
Okay, so I know that you're going to do another podcast after this one, right? So
look, I had to do one just before, so okay. Fortunately my brain still worked. Quite often it ceases to do so after a couple of hours, but I think it still works.
I think it's working a lot better than some brains at the moment, I have to say, in this world. We'll put I'll put the link to the book Cynical Theories below when we post this on YouTube, and also a link to Counterweight, which is this wonderful organization in the UK that you've been talking about. And
yeah, please let New Zealanders know we are there for them too. And if there are any New Zealand lawyers, academics, professionals who want to volunteer their services, we would be very grateful.
Well, that's good to know, and I may take you up on offer whatever services I can, because I'm very much into trying to make international links in these kinds of endeavours, because
yep,
we do have to pull together.
Very welcome, yes please.
All right, so let's thank Helen. Thank you very much for coming on Free Kiwis.
It was nice to see you again, James.
Yeah,
I hope you'll be back in London at some point.
I do too, actually. I'm very keen, but you know, what can you do? Hopefully, I'm hoping for people, my friends in the UK, my family that the lockdowns are able to be eased and conditions improve. So yeah, fingers crossed.
Thank you, Helen. Very nice to meet you.
And you, Michael. Take care.